So by engaging in practices like this again and again, cultivating attention, practicing attention, we build integration largely in that prefrontal cortex and the connections of that prefrontal cortex to other brain areas. And this fosters integration. And integration, as we mentioned before, is fundamental to well-being. That's the main mechanism by which this works in terms of our brain and mind functioning. This can also be called mind training. This is training our minds. This is through focused attention, which we just practiced in that exercise. The direction was to focus your attention on the sound and also to notice what's happening in terms of your internal response to it. So focused attention is one kind of mindfulness practice. Open awareness is a different one. You'll probably practice that sometimes in some of what you're going to be learning. Yep. And then the other direction is to have a kind intention, to bring this intention of kindness toward yourselves and then toward your group. You're going to be doing this in a group. So these are the three main components of training our minds. And what this does is it cultivates a state within us of being in a receptive frame of mind. And being in a receptive frame of mind allows us to be curious and open, accepting and loving. And when we are in a state of being curious and open, we are much better able to learn, to problem solve, to be creative, and to work better with others. So ultimately, our goal is to more often be in a receptive state of mind. We are much more effective and functional and capable of doing our jobs to the best of our ability when we are in a receptive state of mind. So practicing mind training, mindfulness, allows us much more often to be in a receptive state of mind, to function from that place. The opposite of that is being in a reactive state of mind. And when we're in a reactive state of mind, probably we're all familiar with what that feels like. We're much more shut down. We're less able to problem solve. We're less able to think. We are more likely to be emotionally reactive, impulsive, less open to the input from others. It's less functional. It's less, we're less effective. So mind training helps us to stay more in this receptive state of mind and to be more effective interpersonally, in our jobs, in our relationships. So that's the goal. So for training our minds, I think it's always useful to have a concept of what is the mind. That previous slide was information from one of my favorite neuroscientists and psychiatrist, Dan Siegel. This is his working definition of the mind. It's an emergent, self-organizing, embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. I think there are a few important points here that may not be obvious to us as we think about the mind and what is our mind and how are we working with our mind, practicing mindfulness or doing mind training. I think many of us might think about our minds as emanating from our brains. I think what's useful and interesting about this definition, and maybe beyond how most of us conceptualize our minds, is that our minds, according to this working definition, our minds are embodied, include our bodies, and our minds are relational, so include others, include the way we relate to others, are influenced by others, the way we relate to others. And here then it becomes important to think about including others then. So this is where, in the program that you're going to be doing here with Studio B, engaging in these practices together as a group becomes really important and interesting. That community practice as a way of doing mind training and mindfulness practice and working with our minds becomes very powerful and interesting. I think that's a really important and wonderful part about the program that's been designed for you. And then body practices are very useful to include in terms of working with our minds. Those are available in some of the practices you're doing in the, yes, there are going to be some embodied practices, and then they're also available to you on the Studio B platform. So this is a more integrated definition of mind that includes the body as not separate, and that includes relationships as not separate. So this is about the mechanism of how mindfulness works. How? How does it actually work? Again, the key mechanism is this attention, cultivating attention, and it's the control of our attention, being able to choose where we place it and keep it there. So the practice, again, is I'm choosing to place my attention where I'm placing it. And the stability, cultivating stability, how able am I to keep my attention there, or to notice when my attention has wandered and to bring it back, that stability of attention. And the efficiency with which I can direct my attention where I want it and maintain it there, that I can change my attention to place it where I want it to go. That's the key mechanism by which mindfulness works. Probably most of you can relate to the experience of feeling scattered. Your attention's being drawn everywhere, even when you don't want it to be. It doesn't generally feel good, but when we feel more collected and calm, or what some people describe as in a flow state or in the zone, it generally feels better. We feel more effective. We feel more capable. We feel more calm and steady. That's generally a state associated with stability of attention, and where we feel more in control of our attention. And in that state, we generally feel less overwhelmed by stress coming in. We feel a little bit more in control of how we respond to what's happening to us. And generally, stresses are less about what's happening to us than about how we respond to the what, how we respond to what's happening to us. We are largely not in control of what happens to us, but only how we respond to what happens to us. Secondary mechanisms that are related have to do with cognitive flexibility, emotion regulation, and empathy. You're going to hear more about that from Dr. Myers. Empathy. Behavioral non-reactivity. Again, if we have more choice about where we're placing our attention and how, we can be less reactive, more in that receptive state of mind, less in a reactive state of mind. And physiologic resilience. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. So physiologic resilience is the capacity of our body to respond to stress and to return to a state of equilibrium or rest after a physiologic stress. And we generally accomplish that through the autonomic nervous system. Our body has ways of doing that. We have our autonomic nervous system is largely in charge of that. The two main branches being the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of our nervous system. And when we are in sympathetic dominance, that's the stress state. And when we are in parasympathetic dominance, that is the rest and restore state. And the goal is to be in parasympathetic predominance, where we feel more rested, more restored, more relaxed. And there are ways to cultivate that. Exercise is one of them. So when people exercise more, you immediately have an experience of being more calm, but also a longer-term experience of being more calm. And that's through cultivating vagal tone or a parasympathetic predominance. But there's another way of doing that, and there are some exercises that can help with this. And one of them is called resonance breathing. This is not specifically a mindfulness practice, but you'll also notice there are breathing practices related to your mindfulness practices. And I wanted to mention this one because It is easily accessible. It's easy to practice anywhere, anytime, even just for a few minutes at a time. And many people find it quite helpful immediately and also in the long term. So the purpose of it, again, is to cultivate and strengthen the innate capacity of the body to return to a state of calm after a stressor, and this is called physiologic resilience. The method is a very slow-paced breathing where the exhale matches the inhale, and it's at a pretty slow respiratory rate. It's only 4 to 6 breaths per minute, which you'll recognize as a pretty slow rate. Our normal resting rate is anywhere from 12 to 15 breaths per minute. If you prolong the exhale even further, this has a further decrease in the heart rate. The result for more people is quite a subjective sense of calm. Most people experience that even after just a few minutes of practice. They experience a sense of well-being, and then there also are associated improvements in biological markers. So heart rate variability, which is a proxy measure for physiologic resilience, and inflammatory markers. So there are actually measurable markers here that this is a useful practice. There are, of course, apps for this available now, and those are listed at the end of my presentation if anyone is interested in that. Again, how do these work? What's the mechanism? Breathing practices and mindfulness foster parasympathetic predominance. Moral resilience, we haven't talked about that much yet, but they help us by decreasing moral distress. They help us remain in receptive mind instead of reactive mind. And they help us stay aware of and open to connection to others. Again, if we're more in a receptive mind, we can be more aware of and open to connection to others. And so it's also through connection to others that we are more open to social supports and relationships, which was another dimension of resilience that we were talking about earlier. And so I'm going to speak a little bit more about that now. What about relationships? These are a really important dimension of resilience. And so I was very glad that this is included in your program, that you're going to be doing practices in groups, because peer support and team support is going to be really fundamental. You already know that because you work in groups oftentimes, right? You know that your relationships to peers and your relationships to mentors are really important in terms of how supported you feel in the workplace. But this can be further cultivated and strengthened in building resilience. How does mobilizing support work? How does that help us? It engages specifically these resilience factors, our attachments to others, our collective and shared goals, and our sense of belonging. Sometimes these can feel compromised when we're under stress, and when those do feel compromised, we need to deliberately shore them up and re-engage them. And this can be done in workplaces, but sometimes needs to be done with more intention. Like community can be fostered, a sense of community can be fostered and cultivated. So this is one of the important dimensions of the practices that you're going to be doing, is that they're practiced in groups, and you can support one another in doing these practices. Talk with one another about what it's like, and maybe even practice with one another more outside of the formal setting in which you're learning them and doing these practices. So I think it's also useful to point out that when you're doing these practices together, you can cultivate this manner of doing them. You want to establish and maintain this trusting connection with one another and a non-judgmental stance toward one another. You want to practice being fully present to each other and listening attentively to one another. And I think what I wanted to point out here is that this is, in fact, quite closely aligned with what the definition of mindfulness is, according to Jon Kabat-Zinn. So, in other words, paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So it's bringing a stance of mindfulness to the group experience. So it's just another way of practicing that can actually reinforce and support the practices in the group setting that will strengthen the group support. So another reason I'm pointing this out is, as I was saying earlier, burnout is not an individual matter. It's a systemic problem. So the solutions can't be individual solutions. They have to be systemic solutions. One systemic solution is building community support, building community connection, and changing culture in an organization. And this is one of the ways in which it's done. You build community and you change culture. And this is one of the ways it's done, by enhancing community connection and changing culture. And here's how that works when you grow peer and organizational connections. These are the things that tend to happen. This is from Yalom and Lesh, who study groups and how group connections help. Reduces a sense of isolation among people who are working together. Increases a sense of connection, builds cohesion, instills hope, can help us shift perspective. We appreciate more a sense of common humanity, that we're not alone in the sense of what stresses us and what we're concerned about. And we also have an opportunity to practice altruism. That's a sense of helping one another, and that's a quite important feature if we recognize that we're in this together and we can help and support one another. Surely all of you have experienced a lot of suffering in the last couple of years on a personal level as well as the organizational level. And it can feel very good to know that you're helping and supporting one another in this endeavor. So I wanted to tell you about one particular project that's a mindfulness project that has been implemented in an organization that a colleague of mine works at University of California at San Francisco. That's an example of, it's a mindfulness-based intervention that has shifted the culture in that institution, just as an example of how this can work. So this is called the Honor Project. It's a meaning-centered team intervention that was designed for the team, so not for patients, but for the healthcare professionals who care for neuro-oncology patients in an outpatient neuro-oncology setting. And this colleague of mine designed this intervention because the patients there, they all have brain tumors, and about 90% of them do die of their diseases. And so the teams do experience quite a lot of grief because of the loss of their patients. So she designed an intervention where the teams meet once a month to give voice to their grief and talk about their patients and their care, their connection to the patients and what it means to them to lose their patients. In the time intervening between the monthly sessions, they can write things about their patients. They put cards on a table that's there in a private setting. But what's happened is they've been doing this for years now. They meet every month, and they have a ritual that they go through, but it's also done in this very mindful way where they're paying attention to each other mindfully. What's happened is they all have found that they have better coping, they have a greater sense of meaning, and less sense of isolation, and they experience a sense of altruism. It's been a very positive experience. At the beginning of the pandemic, this colleague and I adapted this intervention to some intensive care units that were experiencing overwhelming loss from COVID. So this is an example of ways in which we can bring mindfulness-based interventions into clinical settings to help change culture and build community among caregivers. So just to summarize, mindfulness is about building connections. So building connections within our brains and minds, in our body, hearts, and minds. This promotes integration within our own systems, integrations in our groups and larger systems. That integration promotes resilience, enhances our connection to ourselves. That in turn supports connections to others, and that further builds our resilience. I think you're going to find that you're able to work on doing all of this in the program that's been designed for you, and that will be taught to you by our lovely teachers and also by the team leads that they'll be working with. Some of you are here, I guess. Who are the team leads who are here who will be working directly with our teachers? That's great. I think it's going to be a really exciting journey for you. So I think I have time for some questions or comments, and I'm very interested to hear from you if you have questions or comments. No? Okay, well, thank you for your attention. It's really been a pleasure to be here with you today.